Daily. This is what I read in February. In February, I read 12 books. I don't always think that star ratings are like a very useful way to talk about books, but my average rating for these books was a 3.5. I had all 5 of the numbers represented. I had some like poor choosing of books in February. Not all of them. I read a lot of books that I really liked, or books that I liked fine, but I'm glad that I read kind of books. But there are a couple of books that I should have known I wasn't going to enjoy. And I read them and then I did not enjoy them. I read 2 middle grade books and 2 YA books and then 8 adult. I don't even really have a primary genre that I read this month. I read some memoirs, some other nonfiction. I read some general fiction. I read a science fiction, a couple of fantasy, and a couple of romance. And a mystery. So quite the genre spread, I guess. The first book I read this month, I don't actually own a copy of, but it was Before Ever After by Jacqueline Woodson. I read my first Jacqueline Woodson book in January and am hopefully going to finish her backlog by the end of the year because I now very much love Jacqueline Woodson. Before Ever After is a middle grade book following a boy named ZJ, whose father is a professional football player, and the book follows his progression in having CTE, which is chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is very common in people who have multiple head injuries, kind of cyclically, which obviously happens with people who play football. Woodson handles this topic with incredible care. She clearly has tremendous empathy for the people that are affected by this and for their families. Obviously, we're being told this story through the point of view of a child whose parent has CTE, but we see the way it affects his father and his mother and kind of the rest of the community that surrounds them. Woodson doesn't villainize the people with CTE. She instead kind of indicts the structures that give these people, who are mostly Black men, this horrible illness. There still isn't a broad support system for people with CTE, but there's more than there was when this book was set in the 90s, where it wasn't even being acknowledged that having concussions over and over has a negative impact on your brain. ZJ is really an incredible narrator. If you want an excellent voice, I highly recommend this book. He is an observant and smart and deeply compassionate kid, and I thought that was such a compelling narrative to read from. I'm just so excited to keep reading everything that Jacqueline Woodson has written. I gave this, again, I don't think star ratings are that useful, but I gave this book 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. I highly recommend it. I need to move on to the other things I read this month. Next up, I finally picked up Run by John Lewis. You might have read Lewis's March series of graphic novels, which follows his involvement in the civil rights movement. Run starts off with Lewis in his role as the chairman of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the series, I think, will cover his time running for office. This first installment talks about the impetus that led to him wanting to run for office. As a quick aside, this book is a physically beautiful object. It feels incredibly well made. The art is wonderful. I just highly recommend having this as a physical object. My only very small complaint about this book is sometimes I was a little bit confused about who was who. There is an index in the back that is very helpful, and obviously you have the whole of the internet to provide additional context, but there was kind of, especially in the beginning, a rundown of a whole bunch of people, and I would have to flip back and be oh, okay, yes, you are this person, I remember, because some of the more minor details of people's jobs I just didn't remember. But that does give you a whole bunch of new people to learn about, which is always fun. But on the whole, I felt the narrative was very clear. It is very readable. I continue to love this series. The book starts with a mention that before Lewis died, he did give final approval on most of the pages in this book, and obviously he was a part of the group of people working to produce this book. I look forward to reading the next, I think, 2 installments in this series. After that, I went back to Jacqueline Woodson. I read Brown Girl Dreaming, which I also don't own yet. Brown Girl Dreaming is a memoir of Woodson's childhood, and it is completely written in verse. I'm not like the biggest poetry person, and in the past, whenever I've read a memoir written in verse, I have not enjoyed it. I cannot think of a single one I have liked until this one, which I did give 4 stars. I had a great time reading it. Again, like, star ratings are iffy, but I did genuinely enjoy my reading experience of this book. I really liked the way that Woodson ties different aspects of her childhood together. I think it's an incredibly well-written and moving memoir. I look forward to reading more of Woodson's work. This is the last Jacqueline Woodson I read this month, but I will be reading more soon. I can't really explain why I read this next book, except I heard about it on the podcast Fated Mates, and I just thought it sounded so bananas and funny. I was like, oh yes, I want to read that funny book. But yeah, I did not like it. So the book is called The Tyrant Alpha's Rejected Mate by Cate C. Wells. I picked this up because it sounded very bananas on the podcast, and because it was like a Kindle Unlimited book and I could basically like read it for free. Not really, obviously, I paid for Kindle Unlimited, but I'd already canceled my Kindle Unlimited subscription and I was just trying to read like a couple more Kindle Unlimited books, even though I've disliked almost everyone I've ever read, so I don't know why I did that. I picked it up because it sounded like bananas in a fun way, and I ended up just hating it generally. I'm sure that this is like for somebody. I'm sure somebody really likes this, but that somebody was not me. This is like a werewolf romance that the world building was very unclear to me. I did not understand what was going on. The main character is disabled. She has a leg that has been grievously injured in the past, and she never like gained the full use of her leg again. I thought the way that disability was treated in this book was probably overtly harmful. I think Wells tried to have a positive portrayal of a disabled heroine, but I do not think she succeeded. This book suffers from a thing that I have read a couple of other times and I have never liked, which is where the author tries to make a society like even more misogynistic than our own society, and then makes it just like an incredibly regressive, restrictive, incredibly misogynistic society, but the heroine is like very modern and feminist, all of these things that would not have been fostered very well in that society. And then by the end of the book, we've like overthrown the patriarchy just incredibly quickly. I just hate that. Like, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't, like, you can't overthrow a system like that just because you kicked one person out, you know? The book made me feel like the author doesn't have a deeply thought out feeling on any of the things she tried to make like statements about, if that makes sense. I absolutely should have DNF'd this book. I ended up giving it 1 star. I actively didn't want the couple to be together. The world building was confusing. I thought the disability representation was terrible, and I just did not enjoy any aspect of my time reading it. I'm sure this book is for somebody. I am just not that somebody. And I have learned my lesson. I am going to stop trying to read Kindle Unlimited books. Next up, I picked up Skye Falling by Mia McKenzie. This is adult fiction. Skye Falling follows a 38-year-old black woman named Skye who is the transient owner of a guided travel company. Every 3 months, after going on a couple of trips in various places around the world, she spends a few weeks in Philadelphia, which is her hometown, where she kind of spends most of her time avoiding everyone from her previous life. The book starts with her back in Philadelphia at her kind of only remaining friend's bed and breakfast that she stays in. Her friend convinces her to go to an art show of another friend, And while there, she meets somebody she was not expecting to meet. 12 years previously, Skye had been an egg donor for like a vague acquaintance, and now her egg is a 12-year-old girl and has come to get to know Skye as her mother has just died. The child's name is Vicky. Throughout the course of this book, Skye and Vicky get to know each other. Skye becomes a regular occurrence in Vicky's household. Vicky lives with her aunt, who Skye has a thing for. This book has a really strong character voice. If you love character-focused books, I would absolutely recommend this book, especially if you want themes of like community building, specifically Black community building, confronting past trauma, finding a sense of home, processing grief, and embracing anger. If you are the kind of person who wants like every single thing to be completely wrapped up by the end, then this might not be for you. But I do think that like overall you do get answers to most of your questions, and the end is in a very like emotionally satisfying place. There were a few things that I wanted more of an answer to, and I sometimes felt like 12-year-old Vicky was falling into the like sage child trope that I don't always love. But on the whole, I did enjoy this book. I gave it 3 stars, and I'm excited to read more Mia McKenzie in the future. Next up, I picked up The Proposal by Jasmine Guillory. This book continues my trend of not being very good at picking what romance novels I will actually like. This is an adult romance. This book follows Nick, a Black female freelance writer, and Carlos, a Latino doctor. They meet at a baseball game, which is why the cover is very baseball-y. I did think this was going to be a sports romance just because of the baseball things, but it is not, if you are also confused by that. Here's your warning. The pair meet when Nick is proposed to on the Jumbotron at a baseball game. She says no and is abandoned by her would-be fiance and his friends. Carlos and his sister come and like whisk Nick away because she's kind of being preyed upon by the cameras, and she clearly is very uncomfortable. I really liked the premise of this book, that's why I picked it up, but as the book went on, I didn't really feel like the premise made the most sense with how the characters developed throughout the book. My biggest issue with this book is a lot of it centers around domestic violence, and a lot of the solution-y part of the book was really focused on like personal responsibility, which I don't love. I felt like Nick's past relationship that included like emotional abuse, I didn't think it was quite as prominent in the story as I would have expected it to be, and there is like a tertiary character whose only like real scene is like recounting her violence for other people, which I personally don't love. I just didn't like that like such a minor character got like the really heavy emotional part of this book, and we kind of never checked in with this character afterwards, or I don't know, it just felt like she was just there to be like traumatized but like successful, and I don't know, that didn't work for me. Another aspect I didn't like is I thought there was a lot of dissonance between what the author was telling us about the gender dynamics and the way that I was interpreting the gender dynamics. Especially during one point in the book where Carlos is angry with Nick and he has like a very big emotional outburst, and I don't think that is ever actually like properly addressed in a way that I found satisfying. So I just like didn't gel with this book very much. I just really want the couple to be together. I was like, you can find someone better, Nick. There were things I liked about this book. I did like a lot of aspects of the friend group. I would have absolutely loved a book about the 3 of them. I thought they were a really fun group of women, but the romance part of the book didn't work for me, and this is a romance. So I know that this book has found like an audience that loves it, and I hope it continues to find more people that love it. I'm just not one of those people, and that's fine. I'm giving it 2 stars. I might read another Jasmine Guillory, but who knows? Next up, I read Death on the Nile by Agatha Christie. This is obviously an adult mystery. I picked this up because my parents wanted to see the movie, and I said I would go with them. This is a murder mystery that takes place mostly on a boat on the Nile. The people at the center of the story are a newly married couple, the man's ex-girlfriend who he broke up with like mere months ago, and a variety of people in the like close friends and family of mostly the bride. I really liked the red herrings in this book. I was able to identify two of them and be like, okay, this isn't important, but they want me to think it's important. But one of them like completely got me hook, line, and sinker. I was sure I was right, and then of course I was wrong. I thought the solution was also like really clever and fun to read. I think I would have figured it out, but one of the characters said something that was a lie, but I interpreted it as old-timey sexism. So I was just like, ugh, Agatha Christie, that's so annoying and old-timey of you. But it was, you know, there to distract me, and I was distracted. One heads up is there are multiple times in this book where characters are overtly racist to the people of Egypt, and it is like obviously completely unchecked by the book. It's mostly in the first 100 pages. But two more menial things I didn't like about the book is I didn't love the pacing. The first half of the book is the setup to the murder, so no one is murdered for quite a long time, which is obviously fine. But I was a little bored through the setup, which probably led to me being easier to trick. Also, the cast in this book is pretty huge, so there was some confusion on who exactly was who for a little while. I eventually just like figured out that I only really needed to be paying attention to like 6 people, and then it like went much more smoothly once I figured out who like the key players are. My last little complaint is I did think the reveal was absolutely excellent, but I do not understand why the killer confessed. I don't think they had any real reason to confess. I ended up giving this book 3 stars. Okay, next up I read Bombshell by Sarah MacLean, and I was absolutely delighted because I picked this book up and I was like, I think I'm going to love this book. Even though I'd read one other book by Sarah MacLean, A Rogue by Any Other Name, I didn't super enjoy that one. I thought I'm going to like Bombshell, and I was right, so I'm excited that I'm maybe finally figuring out how to pick out romance that I'll actually enjoy. Bombshell follows Lady Cecily Talbot, who is basically a walking scandal, and the American Caleb Calhoun, who has just arrived back in London from Boston. 2 years previously, he left London after Cecily like confessed her feelings for him. He left London immediately after Cecily confessed her feelings for him. In the 2 years since Caleb has been gone, Cecily has joined a group of women who kind of do like vigilante work against powerful men. Her group of women is based on the real group of women called the 40 Elephants, who were an old-timey girl gang, which sounds really interesting, and I really should do more research into the actual group of women because that sounds fascinating. This is the first book in the Hell's Bells series, and the next few books I assume will follow the rest of our bells. Caleb is in business with Cecily's sister and has kind of been assigned figuring out what's going on with Cecily by her sister, and Cecily has kind of been assigned figuring out what secrets Caleb is hidden by the Duchess, who is the leader of the Bells. This book is like dramatic and romantic and incredibly fun. I just really loved reading it. It has all my favorite things in a romance. There are like secrets and lies and people. I love it when people apologize to each other, and this book has like some really great apologies. And it does a really good job of building a partnership, which is fantastic to read about. I loved the way this book like built up to the big secret. I loved all the reveals. I just had a tremendous time reading this book. I gave it 5 stars, and I'm really excited to continue forward with the series and read more of MacLean's backlog. Next up, I read YA Fantasy Within These Wicked Walls by Lauren Blackwood. This is an Ethiopian-inspired Jane Eyre retelling. I really found the first 70 pages of this book very engaging. I normally have a really hard time with the beginning of books, but I had a great time with the beginning of this book, unfortunately. After the first 70 pages, I had a lot of things that I didn't like very much. First of all, as a warning, I would not listen to this audiobook. The volume is inconsistent. There are lots of popping noises, especially if you listen in headphones. The volume goes way down and then you just have enough time to turn it up when it goes back to the original volume and then like screams in your ear. I don't understand what was going on with the person who produced that audiobook, but it is not done well. I would recommend reading the physical book. This book is very focused on the romance, and I thought the romance was my least favorite part of the book. I thought that the hero was petulant and childish, and I don't understand why anyone likes him, much less two of the women in this book. I didn't quite realize I was supposed to be finding him charming until the scene before they kiss for the first time. So that's confusing. I was like, oh yeah, we hate this guy. That's such a fun take on Mr. Rochester, making him like somebody who we hate. And then I realized that I was not supposed to hate him. I was supposed to be finding him charming, and I did not find him charming at all. I think that the dynamic between the characters would have made a lot more sense if they were like 14, 15, maybe even younger than that, and not 19 and 22. My other big issue is I think the characterization changes wildly throughout this book. I think a lot of people's personalities change drastically based on what is needed from them from the scene. This was most prominent with the character Karla, who was like this cruel, vapid, like out for blood woman who just wanted the hero's love for like 70% of the book. And then she suddenly becomes incredibly selfless and just like a deeply kind, caring, brave person, only to then become somebody who's very forgetful and like doesn't have the single-minded focus she had the whole rest of the book. So after she's impulsive and cowardly, then she kind of like fulfills her role in the book and just kind of disappears. Similar character dynamics are true of anyone who had enough page time for you to understand their personality. The book like builds tension really well and then like pops it, and it's so confusing. The relationship in this book that I really wish had been the focal point was the relationship between the main character Andy and her like father figure Jember. I think that would have been a fascinating book. I would have loved that book, but that relationship kind of became important in the last 50 pages of the book and wasn't the focus of the whole story. I am sure that this is the book for some people. It just happens to not be the book for me. That's fine. I gave it 2 stars. I picked this book up because of a book club I am in. I probably wouldn't have picked it up otherwise because I've never read Jane Eyre. And then I reread The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. I read this book I think in January of last year, and I was so excited to reread this book. I loved it even more my second go around. This is an adult science fiction that follows Kara, who is a traverser. Traversers are people who can jump from our dimension to other Earths, essentially. They go to the other versions of Earth. There are like 380 that we can go to, and they collect data which helps figure out what's going to happen in our version of Earth, or how the other versions are different. Kara is uniquely situated to be a traverser because you can only jump to other versions of Earth where you are dead, and Kara is dead in all but 8 of the other Earths. Towards the beginning of this book, Kara finds out that another her has died. Kara wants to figure out what's going on with the other hers, and also her job might be in danger of being eliminated soon. If her job is terminated, Kara has to go back to living outside of the city in a community that really lacks resources. Kind of the only thing I don't absolutely adore about this book is on my first reading I found part of the middle a little bit slow. On the second reading I found nothing slow. I think this book really rewards reading it multiple times, but even if you just read it once, the payoff, the reveals, and the like high action of this book are all like superbly done. This book also talks about a lot of like social themes. Kara is a Black bisexual woman, and this book talks a lot about race, and it really talks about class really in depth and with a lot of nuance. The book also talks a lot about religion and science, and it's just like really well written. I absolutely love this book. I recommend it to anybody, especially if you love science fiction. This is such a fun piece of science fiction. The next book I read I also don't own. The Undocumented Americans by Karla, Cornejo, Villavicencio. This book is a piece of nonfiction. It's a chronicle of older undocumented immigrants in the US. I really love nonfiction where the author's voice is very apparent in the book. I don't always like it when authors like erase themselves from nonfiction. It feels disingenuous, and in this book Karla is incredibly present in the narrative that she's constructing. Karla herself is undocumented, and she's very much like the kind of undocumented story that we hear a lot. Somebody who is incredibly successful. She went to Harvard. She has a career in writing. She's achieved a lot of things throughout her life. But throughout the book, Karla tells the story of people who are much more overlooked. She tells the story of people who are largely day laborers or who work in restaurants and factories. And Karla focuses a lot on the undocumented people who did search and rescue and cleanup after 9/11. If you want to read like compassionate, informative nonfiction, I highly recommend this book. I gave it 4 stars. I'm really interested in reading more of this author's work. And then the last book I read this month is a YA fantasy. It's Gallant by Victoria Schwab. I guess last month. The last book I read in February. I love Victoria Schwab. I loved this book. Gallant follows Olivia Pryor, who is a orphaned girl living in a girls' home. She is mute and doesn't really have access to anyone any longer who signs. She also sees ghouls, and she has a diary from her dead mother. One day she receives a letter from her uncle saying that they are so happy to have finally found her and they want her to come live at Gallant with them. Olivia has heard of Gallant before because in her mother's journal it says that under no circumstances should Olivia ever go to Gallant. She of course does. I really loved this book. If you want like a ghost story, if you want creepy, spooky, emotional, insular, this is great. I think that a lot of this book is very interesting to read through the lens of it like having been written during lockdown. I just highly recommend this book. 5 stars. I loved it. That was everything I read in February. Hopefully this video was not too long. Thank you for watching. Bye!